After 32 years of marriage, I received a phone call that shattered my reality. My doctor told me he had found something disturbing in my routine blood test. I went into his office expecting bad news, maybe cancer, maybe a heart condition. But what he said was impossible. He looked me dead in the eye and told me that my children, the son and daughter I had spent my entire life building an empire for, could not possibly be mine. In that single moment, the truth destroyed everything I believed about my life, my wife, and the legacy I had bled for. If you are watching this right now, take a deep breath, because what I am about to share is the kind of ultimate betrayal you never think will happen under your own roof. Before I continue this story, please let me know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you have ever had your trust broken by the people you loved the most. My name is Rick. I am 70 years old, and I live in Denver, Colorado. Last month, I went to see my primary physician, Dr. Berman, for some standard preoperative blood work. I was scheduled for a minor knee replacement surgery, just the normal wear and tear from a long life of brutal physical labor. Dr. Berman and I have known each other for 20 years. We play golf together. He knows my family. But when he walked into the examination room that morning, he did not have his usual friendly smile. He held a thick manila folder, and his face was completely drained of color. He closed the door quietly and sat down heavily on the stool across from me. He took a deep breath and told me that the lab had run a comprehensive genetic screening panel, which is a new standard protocol for surgical clearance. I asked him if my heart was failing. I asked him if I had leukemia. He shook his head. He opened the folder, his hands trembling slightly, and placed a printed laboratory report right in front of me. He said, "Rick, there is no easy way to say this. The genetic test revealed a rare anomaly. You have a Y chromosome microdeletion. You have been completely sterile since birth." I stared at him, trying to comprehend the words. My brain simply refused to process the information. I told him he had to be mistaken. I laughed a dry, nervous laugh and told him I have a 31-year-old son named Derek and a 28-year-old daughter named Melanie. I told him I stood in the delivery room and held them both minutes after they were born. Dr. Berman did not laugh back. He looked at me with a mixture of profound pity and absolute clinical certainty. He leaned forward and said, "Rick, I ran the test 3 separate times to be absolutely sure because I knew what this meant. Your body does not produce sperm. It never has. There is zero medical possibility that you fathered those children." The silence in that sterile white room became deafening. The air was sucked right out of my lungs. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck and a heavy, crushing weight press down on my chest. Sterile since birth. Zero medical possibility. Those words echoed in my ears over and over again, like a judge handing down a death sentence. I do not remember walking out of the clinic. I only remember sitting in the parking lot, gripping the leather steering wheel of my truck so hard my scarred knuckles turned white. As I drove blindly through the familiar streets of Denver, my mind spiraled backward through 3 decades of my life. I thought about the year Derek was born. I was working 14-hour shifts, driving a rust bucket van with a broken heater, crawling through freezing attics and blazing hot commercial crawl spaces, fixing air conditioning units until my hands bled. I tore my body apart to build my company, Dawson Heating and Air. I started with nothing, absolutely nothing, and I built a $30 million corporate empire from the ground up. And I did every single bit of it for them. Every missed weekend, every late night, every drop of sweat and missed vacation was dedicated to building generational wealth so my children would never have to struggle the way I did growing up. I promoted Derek to Vice President of Operations 2 years ago. I was carefully paving the way for him to inherit the throne, to take over the legacy I had built with my bare hands. I paid for Melanie's expensive private college tuition, her luxury destination wedding, her comfortable, privileged life. I had sacrificed my youth, my knees, and my back for a bloodline that did not even belong to me. My vision blurred with tears of pure, unadulterated rage. I had been funding a biological lie for over 30 years. My entire existence was a joke played on me by the woman I slept next to every single night. I pulled into the sweeping driveway of my sprawling custom-built home, the home my sweat paid for, the home my wife Joanne decorated with my hard-earned money, filling it with expensive furniture and smiling family portraits that were nothing but beautifully framed lies. I turned off the engine and sat in the quiet cabin of my truck for a long time, trying to steady my breathing. I had to walk through that door and face the woman who had looked me in the eyes and lied to my face every single day for 32 years. I unlocked the heavy wooden front door and walked inside. The smell of expensive roasted garlic and rosemary filled the warm air. Joanne was standing at the marble kitchen island, pouring a glass of imported red wine. She was laughing brightly into her cell phone, completely carefree. I heard her say, "Oh, Derek, your father will just have to deal with it. We are going to have a wonderful time on the company retreat, whether he wants to go or not." She turned around, saw me standing in the dimly lit hallway, and her perfect, practiced smile widened. "Hello, darling," she chirped, completely oblivious to the storm standing in front of her. She had absolutely no idea that I was holding a piece of medical paper in my jacket pocket that was about to burn her perfect, parasitic world to ashes. I walked toward the marble island. Joanne kept smiling, holding the wine glass in one hand and the phone in the other. She finally noticed the cold, dead look in my eyes. Her smile faltered slightly. She told Derek she would call him back and hung up. She asked me if something was wrong, her voice laced with that practiced, gentle concern I had trusted for over 3 decades. I did not say a single word. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out the medical file, and slammed it down onto the granite countertop. The sound echoed through the massive kitchen like a gunshot. She flinched, stepping back, her eyes darting from my face to the folder. I told her to open it. I told her to read the lab results from Dr. Berman. She hesitated. Her manicured hands trembled slightly as she reached out and flipped open the cover. I watched her eyes scan the medical jargon, searching for a way out. She read the conclusion. Y chromosome microdeletion, sterile since birth. I waited for the confusion. I waited for her to tell me there was a mistake, that the doctor was wrong, that we needed a second opinion. But she did not do any of those things. Instead, she froze. Her body went completely rigid. The color drained from her face, leaving her pale and exposed. Then, the performance began. Within seconds, her eyes filled with tears. Her lower lip began to quiver. She dropped the folder, covered her face with her hands, and collapsed against the counter, letting out a wretched, heartbroken sob. It was a flawless display of devastation, a masterclass in manipulation. If I had not spent 30 years negotiating with ruthless corporate sharks, I might have fallen for it instantly. She slid down to the floor, weeping violently, begging for my forgiveness. She cried out that she was so sorry, that she had carried this terrible burden for 33 long years just to protect me. I stood over her, feeling cold and detached. "Protect me," I repeated, my voice devoid of emotion. "Protect me by letting me believe I had biological children for 30 years. She looked up at me, her mascara running down her cheeks. She nodded frantically, scrambling to her feet and reaching out to grab my shirt. She told me a story that sounded perfectly rehearsed. She said that before we were married, she found an old medical report in my apartment. She claimed she saw the diagnosis back then. She knew I was sterile, but she also knew how desperately I wanted a family, how my entire identity was tied to building a legacy and having an heir to pass my business down to. She cried harder, saying she could not bear to break my heart. She told me she wanted to give me my dream at any cost. So according to her, she secretly visited an anonymous sperm bank in the city. She selected a donor whose physical traits closely matched mine, underwent the insemination procedures alone, and carried the secret to protect my fragile ego. "I did it out of love, Rick," she sobbed, clutching my hands tightly. "I wanted to give you the family you always prayed for. I never slept with anyone else. I swear to you on my life, I just wanted you to be a father. I wanted you to be happy." Her words hit me hard. The anger that had been boiling in my blood began to war with the deep, ingrained love I had for the life we built. I looked at this woman weeping on the kitchen floor. I thought about Derek and Melanie. I thought about the first time Derek rode a bicycle without training wheels. I thought about walking Melanie down the aisle, how tightly she squeezed my arm. They were my kids. I had bathed them, disciplined them, funded their dreams, and loved them with every fiber of my being. An anonymous donor did not change the late nights I stayed awake worrying about their fevers. It did not change the fact that I was the one who raised them. I felt a crushing wave of exhaustion wash over me. The adrenaline faded, leaving me feeling every single one of my 70 years. I looked down at Joanne. Part of me wanted to throw her out of the house, but the father in me wanted to preserve the family I had given my life to create. I took a deep, shuddering breath. I pulled my hands away from her grasp. I told her that keeping a secret of this magnitude was a betrayal I did not know how to process. But then I stopped. I closed my eyes and pictured my children. I told her I would not destroy our family over an anonymous donor. I told her I loved Derek and Melanie, and that they were my children in every way that truly mattered. I agreed to swallow my pride and keep her secret for the sake of the kids. Joanne wept with profound relief. She thanked me profusely, kissing my hands. I told her I was too tired to look at her, and went upstairs to our bedroom, locking the door behind me. I lay in the dark for hours, trying to quiet my racing mind. Around 2 a.m, my throat was dry. I got out of bed and walked downstairs to get a glass of water. The house was pitch black and completely silent. As I poured water into my glass, a sudden bright light illuminated the dark granite countertop. It was Joanne's tablet. She had left it resting near the sink. A new message notification popped up on the locked screen. I stepped closer, my heart skipping a beat. The text was from Derek. It read, "Did the old man buy the clinic story?" The glass slipped from my hand and shattered into 100 pieces on the hardwood floor. Water splashed across my bare feet, mixing with the sharp shards of broken glass. But I did not feel a thing. My entire universe had just shrunk to the glowing rectangular screen illuminating the dark kitchen. The notification sat there, bold and unblinking in the quiet night. Did the old man buy the clinic story? The words burned themselves into my retinas. The profound, suffocating relief I had felt just hours earlier evaporated, replaced instantly by a cold, venomous ice spreading through my veins. I did not move. I barely breathed. My mind, trained over decades to analyze contracts and spot corporate liabilities, began to deconstruct that single sentence. The clinic story. It was not a tearful confession of a desperate wife trying to give her husband a family. It was a fabricated narrative, a designated fallback plan, a story, and the most sickening part of all was the sender. Derek, the son I had raised, the boy I had coached through Little League, the young man whose college tuition I paid, the executive I was actively preparing to hand my $30 million company over to. He was not just aware of his illegitimacy, he was an active participant in managing the deception. I stepped carefully around the shattered glass, leaving the mess exactly where it was. I walked slowly through the dark corridors of my custom-built home. a house that suddenly felt like a crime scene. I made my way to my private study, the only room in the house that was truly mine. I closed the heavy oak door and locked it. I did not turn on the overhead lights. I only switched on the small brass desk lamp, casting long, deep shadows across the room. I sat down heavily in my leather chair. My breathing was slow and measured. The initial shock was gone, leaving behind a clinical, terrifying clarity. I reached for the thick, leather-bound photo albums on the bottom shelf of my bookcase. I pulled them up and spread them across my desk. For the next several hours, in the dead silence of the night, I methodically turned the pages. I looked at 30 years of captured memories with completely new eyes. Eyes stripped of paternal bias. Eyes searching for the truth hidden in plain sight. I looked at a photograph from a family vacation in Aspen when Derek was 16. He was standing next to Joanne, both of them sharing a private, conspiratorial smile while I was looking at the camera. I found another picture from his college graduation. The way they stood together, an invisible wall separating them from me. I had always brushed it off as a close bond between a mother and her firstborn son. I had convinced myself that their whispered conversations and sudden silences when I entered a room were just the normal dynamics of a family. I was a busy man. I was building an empire. Awesome. I provided the wealth, and I assumed the emotional distance was simply the price of my success. But looking at the photographs now, the pieces of a much darker puzzle began to snap together. The alignment was too perfect. Joanne had crafted a flawless illusion of a loving home, while secretly raising Derek to view me not as a father, but as a resource. And Derek had played his part perfectly. He had spent the last 2 years at my firm, nodding, taking notes, and playing the dutiful heir. He had called me dad with a smile while texting his mother about the old man behind my back. They were not a family. They were a syndicate, and I was the mark. Why would a 31-year-old man know about a fake sperm bank story? When did she tell him? How long had they been managing me? A mother does not confess a sperm bank lie to her son unless there is a critical, strategic reason to do so. Unless the truth of his actual paternity is so dangerous, so explosive, that they needed a rehearsed cover story ready to deploy in case my medical records ever came to light. The clinic story was their insurance policy, and I had swallowed it whole. The pain in my chest, the grief of losing the biological connection to my children, began to burn away. It was replaced by something far more powerful. 30 years ago, I was a hungry, ruthless contractor who clawed his way up from the dirt. I had spent decades fighting off aggressive competitors, hostile takeovers, and corrupt vendors. I knew how to wage war. I knew how to dismantle a threat. For the last 10 years, I had softened. I had let my guard down because I believed I was surrounded by the people who loved me. I believed the walls of my home were safe. I was wrong. The enemy was not outside the gates. The enemy was sitting at my dinner table. The enemy was sitting in the executive suite of my company, waiting for me to step down so he could take everything I had built. I leaned back in my chair and watched the sky outside my window slowly turn from pitch black to a pale, bruised purple. The sun was beginning to rise over the Colorado mountains. A new day was breaking. I closed the photo albums and stacked them neatly on the corner of my desk. The time for looking at the past was over. I needed to secure my future. I stood up and walked into my walk-in closet. I did not reach for casual Friday golf attire. I reached for my darkest, sharpest suit. I buttoned my crisp white shirt with steady hands. I tied a perfect, tight knot in my silk tie. I slipped on my steel watch and secured my gold cufflinks. I put on my armor. I was not going to the office as a father. I was going to hunt a traitor. I drove my truck to the headquarters of Dawson Heating and Air. The traffic was heavy, but my mind was completely focused. I pulled into my reserved parking space and stepped out into the crisp Denver air. Walking through the glass doors, I greeted the receptionist with my usual polite nod. To the rest of the world, I was just the founder arriving for another routine day. But beneath the surface, every sense was on high alert. I made my way toward the executive wing, passing rows of busy employees, until I reached the conference room. Inside, Derek was leading a strategy meeting with the regional managers. I stopped quietly in the hallway and watched him through the soundproof glass. For the first time in 31 years, I was not looking at my son. I was looking at a stranger occupying my company. He leaned against the edge of the conference table, casually spinning an expensive pen between his fingers. He made a comment, and the room erupted into obedient laughter. Then I saw it. Derek flashed a sharp, arrogant smirk. It was an expression of pure, unadulterated entitlement. My breath caught in my throat. I had seen that exact smirk before. It was not the generic expression of some anonymous donor from a medical clinic. It was a highly specific, deeply familiar sneer. A ghost from my past was staring back at me through the face of the boy I raised. The jawline, the tilt of his head, the cold calculation in his eyes. It was a terrible, haunting echo. My mind raced, trying to place the memory, but before I could pinpoint the origin of that face, a quiet voice interrupted my thoughts. "Rick, do you have a minute?" I turned away from the glass. Thomas, my chief financial officer, was standing beside me. Thomas had been with me for 25 years. He was a quiet, meticulous man who treated the company ledgers with the reverence of a holy text. He looked nervous, clutching a thick black binder tightly against his chest. I told him to follow me into my office. I firmly closed the heavy mahogany door and locked it, ensuring that we would absolutely not be disturbed by anyone. Thomas sat directly across from my desk, opening the thick binder with uncharacteristic hesitation. He took a deep, shaky breath and told me he had been awake all night carefully reviewing the quarterly asset allocations. He said he needed to show me something that did not make sense. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. I told him to show me exactly what he found. Thomas slid a stack of financial spreadsheets across the wood. He pointed to a series of systemic transfers. Over the last 4 months, Derek had been aggressively moving corporate assets into a secondary holding company. Heavy machinery, newly acquired real estate, and several of our most lucrative maintenance contracts had all been quietly shifted out of the primary corporate structure. I stared at the numbers. The scale of the movement was staggering. I asked Thomas what the purpose of the holding company was. He adjusted his glasses, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. He explained that Derek had authorized the transfers under the guise of corporate tax optimization. But Thomas warned me that the holding company was carrying an enormous amount of toxic, high-risk liability. It was structured in a way that made absolutely zero financial sense for a healthy, thriving business like ours. Thomas lowered his voice and said, "Rick, if this holding company fails, it will drag our core assets down with it. It looks less like optimization and more like a deliberate demolition. We are being gutted from the inside." I stared at the spreadsheets, my pulse pounding in my ears. The midnight text from the tablet belonging to Joanne suddenly made perfect, horrifying sense. Derek was not just managing a fake paternity story. He was actively dismantling the financial foundation of my entire life work. I thanked Thomas, instructing him to keep this conversation strictly between us and to quietly prepare a complete backup of every ledger. I gathered the spreadsheets and walked straight down the hall to the office of Derek. He was sitting relaxed behind his desk, typing a message on his cell phone. I walked in, holding the papers casually by my side. I smiled warmly, playing the role of the tired, trusting father. I told him Thomas had just shown me the recent asset transfers to the new liability holding company. I asked him, in a mild, almost confused tone, to walk me through the strategy behind the tax optimization. Derek barely looked up from his screen. He sighed heavily, leaning back in his expensive leather chair with that same arrogant, haunting smirk. He tossed his phone onto the desk and looked at me with thinly veiled contempt. He said, "You are 70 years old, Dad. You are losing your grip on modern corporate logistics. The market moves fast, and your old-school methods are just not efficient anymore. You need to stop worrying about the day-to-day spreadsheets and just let me handle it." I looked at the man sitting in the office I paid for, wearing the suit my money bought, dripping with the entitlement I had foolishly handed to him. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of the absolute fury burning inside my chest. Instead, I forced a warm, gentle smile onto my face. I nodded slowly and placed my hands in my pockets. "You are right, son," I said smoothly. "I am getting old. You go ahead and handle it." I turned and walked out of his office, closing the door softly behind me. As I walked down the corridor, the final piece of the puzzle locked firmly into place. The invasion had not breached my walls. The attack was coming from inside the house. I walked out of the glass building that held my entire life's work, knowing I could no longer trust a single soul inside it. The people I paid, the executives I mentored, the security staff who greeted me, any of them could be loyal to the son who was actively plotting my financial ruin. I bypassed my executive assistant, ignored my ringing phone, and got back into my truck. I needed to move in complete silence. If Derek was actively transferring assets and Joanne was coordinating a fabricated medical history, they might already be monitoring my corporate email and my personal phone lines. I could not risk a single intercepted message. I drove for 45 minutes, leaving the polished, wealthy streets of Denver far behind me. I headed toward a desolate, forgotten stretch of highway on the industrial outskirts of the city. I pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of a rundown diner that smelled perpetually of stale coffee and fried grease. It was the kind of grim, invisible place where wealthy corporate executives never went. It was exactly what I needed to remain unseen. I walked through the squeaky glass door and slid into a torn vinyl booth in the far back corner, facing the entrance so I could watch the door. 10 minutes later, Victor Russo slid into the booth across from me. Victor was not a corporate lawyer or a polished business consultant. He was a ruthless, retired Federal Bureau of Investigation agent who now operated as a private investigator for people who needed absolute, unquestionable discretion. He was a man composed of sharp angles, wearing a faded brown leather jacket and possessing a cold gaze that missed absolutely nothing in his periphery. I had used him exactly once, 15 years ago, to quietly background check a highly suspicious overseas supplier who tried to defraud my company. He was incredibly efficient, relentlessly brutal, and loyal only to his paycheck and the unvarnished truth. He ordered a black coffee from the tired waitress, waited patiently until she was completely out of earshot, and leaned forward over the scratched table. He asked me why the founder of a $30 million corporate empire was calling an emergency, off-the-books meeting in a roadside diner on a Tuesday afternoon. I looked at his worn, scarred face and told him I needed to wage a silent war inside my own home. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope containing $20,000 in untraceable, non-sequential cash. I pushed it slowly across the sticky table. Victor barely looked at the money. He kept his dark eyes locked firmly on mine, waiting for the instructions. I told him I needed a complete, unrestricted, and aggressively deep dive into the digital and physical life of my wife, Joanne. I wanted to know every single thing she had done, every message she had sent, and every person she had spoken to over the last 10 years of our marriage. I needed absolute access to her deleted emails, her hidden bank accounts, her secret burner phones, and her private social media messages. Victor took a slow, measured sip of his steaming coffee. He asked me if I was just looking for a simple divorce case involving a predictable, boring infidelity. I told him this was much larger and much darker than a simple, momentary affair. I told him my wife had been orchestrating a massive, multi-decade psychological and financial manipulation, and I needed the raw, undeniable data to prove her treachery before she and her son could completely destroy me. Victor nodded slowly, sliding the thick envelope of cash into the inner pocket of his leather jacket without a word. He said getting the complete digital footprint of a suburban housewife would take his team less than 48 hours to compile and verify. Then, I reached into my bag and pulled out a clear plastic evidence bag. Inside the bag was a disposable paper coffee cup with a white plastic lid. It was the exact cup Derek had been drinking from during his executive strategy meeting just 2 hours prior. I had quietly retrieved it from the conference room trash can after he left the floor. I pushed the sealed bag across the table toward him. Victor looked at the discarded cup, then looked back at me, his expression turning entirely serious and professional. I told him I needed a completely off-the-books, highly expedited genetic test. I needed him to extract the saliva sample from that plastic lid and run a comprehensive, undeniable biological comparison. Victor asked me who I wanted to compare the saliva sample against. I took a deep breath, feeling the heavy, bitter weight of the past crashing violently into my present reality. I told him I needed to compare the sample against the DNA profile of a man named Gregory Lawson. For the first time since he sat down in the booth, the stoic, hardened expression on the face of Victor Russo completely broke. His hand stopped halfway to his coffee mug, freezing in midair. He slowly lowered his arm and stared at me with profound, unhidden disbelief. He knew exactly who that man was, and he understood the immense gravity of the name I had just spoken aloud. He leaned across the table, lowering his voice to a harsh, strained whisper that barely carried over the diner music. He asked me if I was absolutely, unequivocally certain I wanted to do this. He raised a scarred eyebrow and told me that Gregory Lawson was a highly dangerous ghost from my past, and asking these kinds of biological questions meant deliberately opening a very specific, very ugly grave that could never be closed again. I looked him dead in the eyes, feeling nothing but cold, calculating resolve burning within my chest. I did not hesitate for even a single second. I told him to dig it up. I left the grim diner and stepped back into the cold afternoon air, knowing that the wheels of my retaliation were finally in motion. The next 48 hours were an agonizing exercise in patience and absolute self-control. I had to return to the sprawling, custom-built house I had paid for and live alongside the woman who had orchestrated my entire 30-year delusion. I had to look into the faces of the children I had loved, fed, and raised, knowing they were potentially the biological weapons of my greatest enemy. That Friday evening, my daughter Melanie came over for our weekly family dinner. She was 28 years old, working as the human resources director at my firm, another position I had handed out of pure, misguided paternal love. The dining room table was set with expensive china and crystal glasses, a perfect stage for their ongoing theater of deception. Joanne had prepared a lavish roast, pouring wine and chatting happily as if nothing in our lives was built on a foundation of rot. As I sat at the head of the table, listening to the hollow chatter, my mind drifted to the name I had given Victor Russo. Gregory Lawson. It was a name I had not spoken aloud in over 3 decades, a name that tasted like rust and bitter ash on my tongue. 31 years ago, long before the mansions and the multi-million-dollar corporate revenues, Gregory and I started the heating and air conditioning business together. We were just 2 hungry, desperate men operating out of a leased garage with a single rusted service van. Gregory was brilliant, charismatic, and incredibly persuasive with clients. But he was also deeply corrupt. 2 years into our partnership, I discovered he had been systematically embezzling funds, bleeding our fragile company dry to fund his own illicit gambling debts. I did not just fire him. I took him to court, froze his assets, and completely ruined his professional reputation in the city of Denver. I stripped him of his equity and forced him out into the cold with absolutely nothing. On the day the judge handed down the final ruling, Gregory stood in the courthouse hallway, looked me dead in the eyes, and swore a vow. He promised me he would take everything I loved. He swore he would infiltrate my life and completely destroy the legacy I was trying to build. I had laughed at his threats back then. I thought he was just a broken, desperate man shouting at the wind. But looking across the dining table at Derek and Melanie, observing the sharp angles of their faces and the cold, calculating way they moved, the terrifying reality of his revenge began to take shape. Melanie interrupted my internal monologue, waving a manicured hand in my direction. She asked me if I remembered to sign the new vendor agreements she had left on my desk that morning. Her tone was dripping with condescension, the kind of voice one uses when speaking to a slow, confused child. Joanne chimed in immediately, reaching over to pat my hand with feigned, sickening sympathy. She told Melanie to be patient, adding that my memory had been slipping lately and that I was just getting tired from working too many hours. It was a perfectly choreographed psychological dance. They were actively building a narrative of my mental decline, laying the groundwork to push me out of my own company. Instead of getting angry, I leaned into their trap. I slumped my shoulders, letting my posture sag into the expensive dining chair. I offered them a weak, apologetic smile and rubbed my temples as if I were battling a sudden headache. I told Melanie I must have forgotten the paperwork, murmuring that the days were just blending together and my mind was not as sharp as it used to be. I said I was incredibly lucky to have Derek handling the complex corporate logistics and Melanie managing the human resources department, because I simply could not keep up with the modern business world anymore. Joanne smiled, a triumphant, predatory gleam flashing in her eyes for a fraction of a second before she masked it with maternal concern. She told me I had worked hard enough and that it was finally time to let the younger generation take the heavy burdens off my shoulders. Melanie nodded in enthusiastic agreement, sipping her wine and discussing how she and Derek were going to streamline the corporate structure next week. I chewed my food mechanically, nodding along with their treason. I was playing the fragile, clueless retiree flawlessly, giving them exactly the performance they needed to feel invincible. They thought they had successfully drugged the guard dog and were freely roaming the vault. They had absolutely no idea that the dog was wide awake, watching their every single move and quietly locking all the exits. The antique grandfather clock standing in the main hallway chimed 8 times, echoing heavily through the house. The lavish family dinner was finally winding down, and the suffocating performance was nearing its inevitable end. Joanne began clearing the dirty china plates from the long table, humming a cheerful little tune under her breath, as if she were the perfect, devoted matriarch. Just as I slowly stood up from the dining chair, my personal cell phone vibrated sharply inside the breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket. It was the private, encrypted line I had specifically established solely for communicating with Victor Russo. I walked purposefully into the kitchen, keeping my back completely turned to my treacherous wife and daughter, so they could not possibly see the sudden, cold shift altering my expression. I reached inside my pocket, pulled the phone out, and looked down at the bright, glowing screen. The notification stared back at me in stark white letters. There was only one text message waiting. It simply read, "Meeting. Now. You need a stiff drink for this." I slipped the phone back into my pocket, my heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I turned back to the warm dining room, where Joanne and Melanie were still laughing loudly over their expensive glasses of wine. I told them I needed to run to the office to grab a forgotten file, playing the confused old man one last time for the evening. Joanne smiled sweetly, telling me to drive safely. Her voice was like poison coated in honey. I walked out to my truck, the cold night air biting at my face, and drove straight toward the address Victor had sent me. It was an abandoned concrete parking structure on the industrial edge of the city. The yellow sodium lights flickered overhead, casting long, distorted shadows across the empty levels. I drove up to the 4th floor, the tires of my truck squealing softly against the smooth concrete. Victor was already waiting, leaning silently against the hood of a dark, unmarked sedan. He did not wave or greet me. He just watched as I parked and stepped out into the freezing wind. I walked over to him, my footsteps echoing loudly in the cavernous, desolate space. Victor reached inside his heavy leather jacket and pulled out a thick manila envelope. He did not hand it to me immediately. He held it for a fraction of a second, looking at me with an expression that bordered on genuine pity. For a man like Victor Russo, pity was a rare and terrifying thing. He finally extended his hand and pressed the envelope firmly against my chest. I took it, my fingers numb from the cold, and tore open the seal. Inside was a crisp, white laboratory report from a private genetic testing facility. I skipped the complex medical jargon and scanned directly down to the final conclusion printed at the very bottom of the page: the probability of paternity. The numbers leaped off the paper and struck me with the devastating force of a physical blow. 99.9%. The DNA sample extracted from the coffee cup of my son Derek was an absolute, undeniable biological match to the genetic profile of Gregory Lawson. I stood there in the flickering yellow light, struggling to draw air into my lungs. The horrific reality of my adult life crashed over me like a massive tidal wave of shattered glass. It was not an anonymous sperm bank. It was never an anonymous donor. 31 years ago, the exact same year I had dragged Gregory Lawson into court, stripped him of his equity, and forcefully expelled him from our heating and air conditioning business, Joanne had sought him out. She did not just comfort my worst enemy. She slept with him. She had a calculated affair with the man who swore he would take absolutely everything I loved. She brought his biological children into my home to be raised under my roof, funded by my sweat and labor. Derek and Melanie were not just the products of infidelity. They were the living instruments of Gregory Lawson's revenge. A sickening wave of profound, physical disgust washed over me. I leaned heavily against the cold metal hood of my truck, closing my eyes as the bitter truth burned through my mind. For 3 decades, I had been the unwitting financier of my greatest rival. I had paid for his son to go to elite private schools. I had paid for his daughter to have a lavish destination wedding. I had literally handed the executive keys of my $30 million corporate empire over to the bloodline of the man who tried to bankrupt me. I had worked myself to the bone, ruining my knees and my back, all to build generational wealth for the family of my enemy. It was a betrayal so deep, so meticulously calculated, that it defied basic human comprehension. Joanne had looked at my sterile diagnosis not as a tragedy, but as a strategic opportunity to secure her financial future while serving me the ultimate defeat. I slowly opened my eyes, the freezing wind whipping against my face, and looked at Victor. He was watching me silently, waiting for the initial shock to settle into pure rage. I folded the laboratory report and shoved it forcefully back into the manila envelope. I told him I needed to know exactly where Gregory Lawson was living right now. I told him I was going to find him, and I was going to systematically dismantle whatever miserable life he had managed to rebuild. I wanted to see the look of terror on his face when I ripped his biological children out of the wealthy lives I had provided for them. Victor did not flinch. He did not mirror my anger. Instead, he reached slowly back into his jacket and pulled out a second, thinner folder. He placed it deliberately on the hood of my truck and slid it across the cold metal. The folder stopped inches from my hand. I looked down at it, a new sense of dread coiling tightly in the pit of my stomach. Victor looked me dead in the eyes, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. He told me I was not going to find Gregory Lawson anywhere. He said Gregory had moved to Seattle decades ago, built a successful real estate firm, and amassed a massive personal fortune. But Gregory was dead. He died of aggressive pancreatic cancer exactly 1 year ago. I stared at Victor, trying to process this new information. My enemy was dead. The man who orchestrated my entire destruction escaped my wrath. I let out a harsh, bitter breath, feeling robbed of vengeance. But Victor tapped his index finger against the thin folder resting on the hood of the truck. He looked at me, his eyes dark and deadly serious. He told me Gregory died of cancer a year ago in Seattle. But that is not the worst part. I stared at the thin folder resting on the freezing metal hood of my truck. The wind howled through the empty concrete parking structure, whipping violently against my face, but I felt completely numb. Victor Russo did not push the file any closer. He simply waited in absolute silence with his hands buried deep inside the pockets of his leather jacket. I reached out with trembling fingers and opened the heavy cardboard cover. Inside was a stack of dense, intimidating legal documents, bound securely by a thick silver staple at the top left corner. The bold header printed across the center of the page read, "Last Will and Testament of Gregory Thomas Lawson." I looked closely at the official ink date stamped aggressively across the bottom of the very first page. The document had been legally executed and formally filed in a Seattle probate court exactly 11 months ago. I asked Victor in a harsh whisper how he managed to obtain a highly confidential, sealed testamentary trust document in less than 48 hours. Victor offered a grim, completely humorless smile. He looked me straight in the eyes and told me that when billions of dollars are involved in a massive estate, corporate loyalty is merely an illusion, and every single low-level county clerk has a specific monetary price. He instructed me to skip the endless pages of boilerplate legal language and turn my attention directly to page 14. My frozen fingers fumbled clumsily with the thick, high-quality paper. I flipped rapidly past the endless paragraphs detailing Gregory and his massive real estate holdings, his sprawling corporate assets, and his endless liquid cash accounts. When I finally reached page 14, my eyes locked immediately onto a highly specific, aggressively highlighted section of text. It was a private, irrevocable trust fund, explicitly established for 3 specifically named beneficiaries: Joanne Dawson, Derek Dawson, Melanie Dawson. The astronomical number printed next to their names in bold black ink made my breath catch painfully in my throat. $50 million. Gregory Lawson had not just left his biological children a comfortable, modest inheritance to help them through life. He had left them an absolute, life-altering fortune. A massive mountain of generational wealth meticulously designed to permanently secure their financial futures forever. I read the date of the mandatory beneficiary notification listed in the margins. The official legal logs confirmed that Joanne, Derek, and Melanie had all been formally contacted by Gregory and his elite estate lawyers exactly 11 months ago. For nearly an entire year, they had known about the $50 million waiting for them in Seattle. For nearly a whole year, they had sat across from me at the mahogany dinner table in my house, smiling warmly and asking me to pass the salt, knowing with absolute certainty that my greatest, most hated enemy was actually their true biological father and their secret billionaire benefactor. But Victor tapped his calloused index finger sharply against the paper, drawing my immediate attention down to the very next paragraph. He told me to carefully read the specific disbursement conditions attached to the massive trust fund. I moved my eyes slowly down to the dense fine print. Gregory Lawson was a vindictive, calculating, and brilliant monster. He knew exactly how to wield his immense wealth to destroy a man from far beyond the grave. The $50 million trust was not a simple, unconditional gift to his secret family. It was a loaded, highly destructive weapon aimed directly at my head. The twisted clause clearly stated that the funds would remain entirely locked and completely inaccessible to the three beneficiaries until one extremely specific, devastating condition was met. Derek, Melanie, and Joanne would only receive the massive financial payout if my commercial heating and air conditioning company was driven into total, unrecoverable corporate bankruptcy, and I, Richard Dawson, was left with a completely negative personal net worth. Furthermore, there was a strict, unyielding time limit deliberately attached to the execution of this financial murder. The complete destruction of my entire life's work had to be legally finalized and formally recorded in a federal bankruptcy court before my 71st birthday. If my company survived past that specific calendar date, the $50 million trust would be permanently voided and donated entirely to a list of random charities. The sheer, unadulterated malice radiating from the legal document was utterly staggering. Gregory had spent 31 years patiently plotting a revenge so complete and so devastating that it defied basic human logic. He had brilliantly weaponized my own fake family against me. He had offered the people I loved $50 million to slit my throat and watch me bleed out in the corporate gutter. Suddenly, every single bizarre, reckless corporate decision over the last 11 months made perfect, terrifying sense. Melanie actively driving up our human resources liabilities by mishandling employee disputes on purpose. Derek aggressively pushing to transfer all our expensive heavy machinery and valuable core assets into a highly toxic, unstable holding company. Thomas had been absolutely right when he warned me earlier today. It was not a misguided attempt at modern tax optimization. It was a highly coordinated, meticulously planned corporate demolition. My son was intentionally sinking my $30 million company simply to trigger his $50 million inheritance. He was entirely willing to leave the man who fed, clothed, and raised him completely destitute, stripped of his legacy and his dignity, just to cash a massive check from a dead man. I slowly closed the heavy file and looked down at my gold wristwatch. I mentally calculated the days left on the calendar. The cold, harsh reality washed over my tired body. My 71st birthday was in exactly 45 days. The countdown was already ending. They thought I was a fragile, oblivious old man waiting quietly for the end. They had absolutely no idea the brutal, uncompromising war that was about to begin starting exactly right now. The drive back to my house from that freezing parking structure was the quietest journey of my entire life. I did not turn on the radio. I did not turn on the heater. I simply let the frigid night air pour through the cracked window, letting the sharp sting keep my mind perfectly clear. The profound, suffocating fog of confusion that had clouded my judgment for the past 3 months was completely gone. In its place was a cold, terrifying, and absolute clarity. Every single strange conversation, every bizarre corporate decision, every misplaced document over the last 11 months suddenly aligned into a perfect, undeniable picture. The enemy had a strategy, and now I knew exactly how they were executing their plan. My mind began to meticulously catalog the damage, starting with the Human Resources Department. I thought about Melanie, my sweet, intelligent daughter, who had begged me for a leadership role in my company 2 years ago. I had given her the position of Human Resources Director, trusting her to protect the culture and the people I had cultivated for 3 decades. But over the last 11 months, the exact timeline since Gregory Lawson passed away, our legal liabilities had skyrocketed. I remembered a specific wrongful termination lawsuit filed by a senior technician just 6 months ago. It was a frivolous, entirely baseless claim. We had a mountain of documented evidence to prove our innocence, and our corporate attorneys had assured me we would win the case easily. But Melanie had forcefully intervened. She had bypassed the legal team, deliberately mishandled the mediation process, and aggressively pushed me to authorize a massive, completely unjustified out-of-court settlement. She had looked me in the eyes and told me the bad press would ruin my legacy, convincing me to bleed $500,000 of company capital just to make the problem go away. At the time, I thought she was just inexperienced and overly cautious. Now, sitting in the dark cabin of my truck, I realized she was intentionally hemorrhaging my cash reserves. She was actively inviting lawsuits, creating hostile work environments, and sabotaging employee relations simply to drain the corporate accounts dry. She was methodically poisoning the well from the inside out. Then my thoughts shifted to Derek, the golden boy, the heir apparent. As vice president of operations, he had unrestricted access to our financial infrastructure. Thomas, my loyal chief financial officer, had warned me about the transfer of our heavy machinery and real estate into a secondary holding company. But that was only the tip of the spear. I remembered a massive operational loan Derek had pressured me to sign 3 months ago. He claimed we needed the capital to aggressively expand our fleet of service vehicles across the state. I trusted his market analysis and signed the authorization, but I had never physically seen those new vehicles. Derek had used the core assets of my company, the warehouses I owned free and clear, the patents I had personally designed, as collateral to secure incredibly toxic, high-interest loans from predatory shadow lenders. He was intentionally piling massive, unmanageable debt onto the balance sheets. He was engineering a financial collapse so catastrophic that the company would never be able to recover. They were going to leave the man who raised them destitute, strip me of my dignity, and force me into bankruptcy simply for a massive payday. The following Monday morning, I walked into the corporate headquarters with a calm, pleasant smile plastered across my face. I greeted the receptionists, drank my coffee, and played the role of the oblivious, tired founder flawlessly. Around 11 o'clock, Derek knocked softly on the heavy wooden door of my office. He walked in carrying a thick, professionally bound black binder. He wore an expensive, tailored suit and a warm, practiced smile. He sat down in the leather chair across from my desk and sighed deeply, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He told me he had spent the entire weekend finalizing the ultimate tax optimization strategy. He claimed this final restructuring would protect my retirement and secure the future of the company for decades to come. He slid the heavy binder across the polished mahogany wood. He told me we needed to finalize the transfer of the remaining operational debt into the holding company. To make it official, he had scheduled a mandatory board of directors meeting for next Friday morning. He looked at me with those cold, calculating eyes, wearing the exact same arrogant smirk I had seen on the face of Gregory Lawson 31 years ago. He told me all I had to do was show up on Friday, sign the final authorizations, and I could finally step away from the burden of leadership. I looked down at the binder, knowing with absolute certainty that the documents inside were designed to trigger a formal bankruptcy. I looked back up at Derek, letting my shoulders sag slightly, playing the fragile old man. I smiled warmly and thanked him for his hard work. I told him I would be there on Friday to sign whatever he needed. The moment Derek left my office, the facade completely dropped. I locked the heavy wooden door and closed the vertical blinds on all the glass windows. I sat alone in the dark, silent office I had occupied for decades. I looked at the framed photographs on my desk, the awards on the walls, the legacy I had built from a single rusted service van. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel sorrow. I only felt a cold, mechanical resolve. I picked up my private cell phone and dialed the direct, unlisted number of my personal attorney. His name was Collins. He was a ruthless, brilliant corporate bulldog who had fought beside me in the legal trenches for 20 years. He was not affiliated with my company, and he answered to absolutely no one but me. He answered on the second ring. I did not offer a greeting. I did not waste time with pleasantries. I spoke in a low, dead, calm voice. I told him to clear his entire schedule immediately. I told him I needed to sell a $30 million company in exactly 5 days, and it had to be done in absolute, uncompromising secrecy. An hour later, I parked my truck in the underground garage of a secure, anonymous office building downtown. Collins maintained a private, off-the-books workspace for highly sensitive corporate negotiations. I rode the private elevator up to the top floor and walked into a stark, windowless conference room. Collins was already waiting. He was a sharply dressed man in his late 60s, with graying hair and eyes that missed absolutely nothing. He had a pot of black coffee waiting on the long oak table. I did not sit down immediately. I opened my leather briefcase and pulled out the thick manila envelope Victor Russo had given me. I laid the genetic testing results directly on the table. Then, I pulled out the copy of the last will and testament of Gregory Lawson. I placed it right next to the DNA report. I told Collins to read them both before we spoke. I poured myself a cup of black coffee and stood in the corner of the room, watching him work. Collins put on his reading glasses and picked up the documents. I watched his face transition from professional curiosity to profound shock, and finally, to cold, simmering anger. He had been my lawyer during the original lawsuit against Gregory Lawson 31 years ago. He knew exactly what that man was capable of, and he understood instantly what these documents meant. Collins dropped the heavy file onto the table and took off his glasses. He looked at me, his voice tight with controlled fury. He said this was the most vile, meticulously calculated corporate assassination he had ever seen in his entire career. He confirmed that my analysis was absolutely correct. Derek and Melanie were intentionally steering the firm into a catastrophic financial collision. The board meeting scheduled for next Friday was not a restructuring session. It was an execution. They were going to trick me into signing documents that would trigger massive default clauses on the toxic loans, instantly forcing the company into involuntary bankruptcy. The moment the judge banged the gavel, my net worth would plummet into the negative, and the $50 million trust would be released to my treacherous family. Collins paced the length of the conference room, rubbing his chin aggressively. He told me the situation was incredibly grim, but he refused to accept defeat. He sat back down at the table, pulled a yellow legal pad from his briefcase, and began dissecting the will of Gregory Lawson line by line, word by word. For the next 3 hours, the room was completely silent, except for the sound of turning pages and a scratching pen. Collins read the complex, convoluted legal language of the trust disbursement clause over and over again. He was searching for a weakness, a crack in the armor, a single misplaced comma that could dismantle a billionaire's revenge. Suddenly, Collins stopped. He froze, his pen hovering just above the yellow paper. A slow, predatory smile began to spread across his weathered face. He looked up at me, his eyes burning with absolute triumph. He tapped the document hard with his knuckles. He told me Gregory Lawson was a brilliant monster, but his lawyers had made one fatal, incredibly arrogant mistake. Collins read the exact phrasing of the poison pill clause out loud. It explicitly stated that the $50 million would only be dispersed if Dawson Heating and Air entered a state of formal insolvency, total dissolution of assets, or legal bankruptcy, resulting in a negative personal net worth for Richard Dawson. Collins set the paper down and leaned forward. He told me the clause required destruction. It required failure. It required poverty. But it completely failed to account for a massive, highly profitable corporate acquisition. I stared at Collins, the gears in my mind turning rapidly. He explained the strategy with surgical precision. If we could sell the company legitimately, transfer the core assets, and execute a massive liquidity event before the deadline, the company would not be bankrupt. It would be acquired. My personal net worth would not be negative. It would instantly skyrocket by tens of millions of dollars in liquid cash. Because the fundamental condition of the will required my absolute financial ruin, a highly profitable sale would definitively and permanently violate the terms of the trust. If I sold the company and walked away rich, Gregory Lawson's $50 million trust would instantly default. The money would be diverted to charity, and my treacherous family would inherit absolutely nothing. The trap would be completely disarmed. But the reality of the timeline was brutal. Collins warned me that selling a commercial empire of this magnitude typically took months of intense negotiations, due diligence, and endless audits. We only had 5 days before Derek forced the bankruptcy signatures at the board meeting. We needed a buyer with incredibly deep pockets, a buyer who already knew the value of my company, and a buyer who could execute a cash acquisition blindly and immediately. I walked over to the large oak table and placed my hands flat against the polished wood. I did not need to search for a buyer. I already knew exactly who to call. For the last 5 years, a massive national conglomerate called Apex Industries had been aggressively trying to buy me out. They dominated the commercial HVAC market on the East Coast, but they desperately wanted my proprietary patents, my elite client list, and my absolute stranglehold on the Western regional market. They had made dozens of extremely generous offers, and every single time I had turned them down because I wanted to leave the legacy to my son. I pulled my private cell phone from my jacket pocket. I scrolled through my encrypted contacts until I found the private, direct line of the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Industries. I looked at Collins, giving him a single, resolute nod. I tapped the screen and pressed the phone to my ear, listening to the dial tone ring in the quiet room. I was about to sell my entire life's work, but I was going to make sure the people who tried to bury me ended up digging their own financial graves. The line connected after the second ring. Bradley Winston, the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Industries, answered with his usual polished corporate tone. I did not bother with pleasantries or formal greetings. I told him I was sitting in a secure room with my primary legal counsel and that I was finally ready to accept the acquisition offer he had been aggressively pushing for the last 5 years. There was a sharp, stunned silence on the other end of the line. Bradley had spent years trying to buy my commercial heating and air conditioning empire. He knew the immense value of my proprietary patents and my absolute dominance over the Western regional market. He asked me what had changed my mind. I told him my priorities had shifted, and I was looking to execute an immediate, uncompromising exit strategy. I demanded a private, face-to-face meeting that very same evening, entirely off the books, with no junior executives and no corporate red tape. Bradley agreed instantly. We met at 8 o'clock that night in the penthouse suite of the Four Seasons Hotel downtown. The room was expansive, decorated with modern art and sweeping glass windows overlooking the glittering Denver skyline. Bradley arrived with his own bulldog corporate attorney and his lead financial acquisition director. I sat across the polished glass table from them, flanked only by Collins. I did not waste a single second. I slid a comprehensive dossier across the table, detailing the current valuation of Dawson Heating and Air, my exclusive client lists, and the intellectual property rights to the high-efficiency ventilation systems I had personally designed. I told Bradley the purchase price was exactly $35 million. I demanded it entirely in liquid cash, and I demanded the transaction be fully funded and legally locked into an escrow account within 72 hours. Bradley leaned back in his plush leather chair, steepling his fingers. He tried to play the usual negotiation games. He argued that a 72-hour due diligence period was completely impossible for an acquisition of this massive scale. He tried to leverage the abbreviated timeline to force the price down to $28 million. I did not flinch. I did not negotiate. I looked him dead in the eyes and told him the price was $35 million, non-negotiable, or I would walk out the door and call his biggest competitor in Chicago. I told him he already knew my books were pristine, my contracts were ironclad, and my market share was completely untouchable. I was offering him the crown jewel of the Western region on a silver platter, and he was going to pay the premium for the speed of the transaction. Bradley stared at me for a long, tense moment. He looked at his attorney, who gave him a slow, silent nod. Bradley extended his hand across the table and told me we had a deal. As Collins and the Apex legal team began furiously drafting the preliminary term sheets, I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows and looked out at the city I had spent my entire adult life trying to conquer. A profound, heavy ache settled deep in my chest. I was selling my life's work. I thought about the grueling 100-degree summers spent crawling through fiberglass insulation. I remembered the freezing winter nights when I had to sleep in the back of my rusted service van because I could not afford enough gas to drive all the way home. I thought about the thousands of hours I had sacrificed, the blood I had spilled, and the sweat that had soaked into the foundation of my company. I built this empire with my own 2 hands, piece by piece, hoping to create a generational legacy that would stand the test of time. It was a part of my soul. But as I watched the headlights moving through the dark streets below, the sorrow was quickly replaced by a cold, calculating survival instinct. My company had been completely infected. The family I had built it for was a poisonous cancer, slowly trying to kill me from the inside out. Liquidating the business out from under them felt exactly like cutting off a gangrenous, infected limb. It was agonizing, it was brutal, and it was going to leave a permanent scar. But it was absolutely necessary to save my own life. I was not just selling a business. I was amputating my betrayers. Collins walked over and handed me the finalized term sheet. I signed my name with a steady, uncompromising hand. The $35 million would be routed directly into a newly established, irrevocable blind trust managed entirely by Collins. My name was the only beneficiary. The money would be completely shielded from any marital asset claims, completely invisible to Joanne, and entirely untouchable by Derek or Melanie. I had secured my absolute financial freedom. I had successfully dismantled the $50 million trap set by Gregory Lawson. But as Collins reviewed the corporate asset registry, a severe complication suddenly emerged. Collins pointed to a newly drafted legal clause regarding the physical transfer of the company assets. Apex Industries was not just buying the brand name. They were buying the heavy machinery, the commercial real estate, and the operational contracts. But Derek had already moved all of those specific assets into his toxic, high-risk holding company under the guise of his fake tax optimization strategy. In order to legally finalize the sale and transfer those assets to Apex, we needed the holding company released. And because Derek and Melanie had legally positioned themselves as the executive directors of that specific holding entity, my signature alone was no longer sufficient. I needed both Derek and Melanie to officially sign the asset release authorizations. If I walked into the office and simply demanded their signatures, they would instantly know something was wrong. They would immediately suspect I had discovered their sabotage, and they would refuse to sign, stalling the sale past the deadline of my 71st birthday. I needed them to sign the Apex acquisition documents willingly, completely oblivious to what they were actually authorizing. The trap had to be perfect. The deception had to be flawless. I left the hotel suite with Collins and drove straight back to his secure, windowless office. It was well past midnight, but neither of us felt the slightest bit of fatigue. We had less than 4 days to engineer the most critical legal deception of my entire life. We sat at the long oak conference table, spreading the Apex acquisition documents out next to the fraudulent bankruptcy files Derek had given me earlier that morning. Collins poured another round of black coffee and rolled up his sleeves. He told me that if we were going to trick 2 ambitious, greedy corporate executives into signing away their entire inheritance, we had to use their own arrogance against them. Collins brought in a specialized legal printing expert to meticulously recreate the exact physical appearance of Derek's restructuring binder. Every single detail had to be absolutely identical. We matched the heavy, textured weight of the legal paper. We matched the precise shade of white. We used the exact same corporate font, the identical margin spacing, and the same customized black leather binder Derek always used for his executive presentations. To the naked eye, the stack of papers looked exactly like the bankruptcy documents Derek expected me to sign, but the actual legal language buried within the dense paragraphs was entirely different. Instead of authorizing the default of our operational loans and plunging the company into insolvency, the documents Collins drafted explicitly authorized the complete, unrestricted transfer of the holding company and all its associated assets directly to Apex Industries. Furthermore, it legally dissolved Derek and Melanie's executive authority over the entities the moment their ink touched the paper. Collins was a master of legal camouflage. He buried the most devastating clauses deep within pages of boring, standard corporate boilerplate, knowing that Derek, blinded by his greed and rushing to trigger his $50 million payday, would simply flip straight to the final signature pages. We spent the next 48 hours refining the trap. Collins drilled me on the exact mechanics of the upcoming board meeting. The entire execution depended on my ability to perform under unimaginable pressure. I had to walk into that glass conference room, sit across from the people who had betrayed me, and swap the binders in broad daylight without raising a single red flag. If Derek noticed the switch, if Melanie decided to actually read the fine print of the documents they were co-signing, or if Joanne sensed a shift in my demeanor, the entire acquisition would collapse. The $50 million trust would remain active, and they would successfully bankrupt me. The margin for error was absolutely zero. I sat alone in the quiet office, visualizing the choreography of the swap. I practiced sliding the fake binder out of my briefcase while maintaining casual, distracted conversation. I perfected the posture of a tired, confused 70-year-old man who simply wanted to sign his life away and go play golf. I had to let them feel incredibly smart. I had to let them feel completely victorious right up until the exact moment the steel jaws of the trap snapped shut around their necks. On Thursday evening, the night before the final board of directors meeting, Collins handed me the perfectly forged, identical black binder. It felt incredibly heavy in my hands. It was not just a stack of corporate paperwork. It was the instrument of my salvation and the absolute destruction of their parasitic lives. I placed the binder carefully inside my worn leather briefcase. I smoothed out the flap, lined up the brass clasps, and pushed down firmly. The lock secured with a sharp, deeply satisfying click that echoed through the silent room. The weapon was fully loaded. The safety was off, and I was finally ready to end this war. I left the secure office building and stepped out into the biting Denver night, carrying the leather briefcase that now held the complete destruction of my betrayers. The drive back to my sprawling suburban estate was methodical and quiet. I pulled through the wrought iron gates, watching them swing shut behind my truck, sealing me inside the very fortress that had been funded by my sweat and occupied by my enemies. The weekend stretched out before me, an agonizing expanse of time where I had to deliver the most flawless performance of my entire life. I walked through the heavy mahogany front door and immediately allowed my shoulders to slump. I let the vibrant, commanding energy of a corporate chief executive drain completely out of my posture. I replaced it with the shuffling, hesitant steps of an aging man who had finally been broken by the relentless demands of the modern business world. I saw Joanne sitting in the opulent living room, bathed in the soft, warm glow of the crystal chandelier. She was reading a glossy magazine, looking every bit the devoted, comfortable matriarch. As I entered the room, I let out a long, ragged sigh and dropped my briefcase onto the plush carpet with a heavy, defeated thud. I sat down slowly on the edge of the velvet sofa, rubbing my temples with trembling fingers. Joanne looked up, her brow furrowing in a perfectly practiced display of wifely concern. She asked me if everything was all right, her voice dripping with that cloying, artificial sweetness I had come to absolutely despise. I did not look directly into her eyes. I kept my gaze fixed on the intricate patterns of the Persian rug beneath my feet. I told her I was mentally exhausted. I let my voice crack just a fraction, injecting the exact amount of vulnerability required to sell the illusion. I confessed that the endless corporate restructuring, the aggressive market shifts, and the sheer volume of daily operational logistics had finally overwhelmed me. I told her that Derek was right all along, that I was simply too old to keep up with the aggressive pace of the industry. I watched her reaction carefully from the corner of my eye. For a split second, the mask slipped. A brilliant, terrifying flash of pure triumph illuminated her features. It was the look of a predator watching its prey finally stumble and expose its throat. But she recovered instantly, replacing the predatory gleam with an expression of deep, nurturing sympathy. She walked over and sat beside me, placing her warm hand gently over mine. She told me I had worked incredibly hard for 3 decades, that I had successfully built a magnificent empire, and that I had absolutely nothing left to prove to anyone. She softly stroked my arm, her voice lowering to a soothing, hypnotic register. She whispered that it was perfectly fine to let go, that Derek was more than ready to step up and carry the heavy burdens for me. She assured me that by signing the restructuring documents on Friday, I was making the wisest, most loving decision a father could possibly make for his family. I nodded slowly, leaning into her comforting touch, fighting every single natural instinct that screamed at me to pull away in absolute disgust. I whispered that I just wanted it all to be over, that I wanted the legal paperwork finished so I could finally rest and enjoy my twilight years in peace. Joanne smiled, a genuine, radiant smile fueled entirely by her own monumental hubris. She stood up gracefully, kissing the top of my head, and told me she was going to brew my favorite chamomile tea to help me relax. As she walked away toward the sprawling gourmet kitchen, I remained seated on the sofa, keeping my defeated posture perfectly intact. The living room was separated from the kitchen by a massive decorative glass partition. Through the distorted reflection of the glass, I watched her movements with clinical precision. She did not immediately reach for the copper tea kettle. Instead, she leaned against the marble island, pulled her sleek smartphone from the pocket of her cashmere cardigan, and began typing furiously. Her fingers danced across the glowing screen with frantic, desperate energy. I did not need Victor Russo or a team of digital forensic investigators to tell me exactly who she was messaging. She was frantically texting the elite estate lawyers of Gregory Lawson in Seattle. She was officially notifying them that the trap was successfully primed, that the foolish old man had completely surrendered, and that the final corporate bankruptcy signatures were absolutely guaranteed for next Friday morning. She was mentally counting the $50 million, dividing the immense wealth in her head, entirely oblivious to the fact that the man she was plotting to destroy was sitting less than 40 feet away, watching her eagerly construct her own financial coffin. I sat in silence, letting her enjoy her final days of imaginary wealth. When she finally returned to the living room carrying a silver tray and 2 steaming porcelain cups of tea, I accepted the warm beverage with a grateful, trembling smile. We sat together in the quiet luxury of our home, 2 people playing a terrifying, high-stakes game of psychological warfare, both absolutely convinced they had already won the war. The weekend dragged on with excruciating slowness. I spent Saturday and Sunday wandering aimlessly around the house, intentionally misplacing my reading glasses, asking Joanne the same mundane questions multiple times, and generally amplifying the illusion of my rapid cognitive decline. Every stumble, every forgotten word, every heavy sigh served to inflate their towering arrogance. They were so intoxicated by their impending victory that they completely stopped hiding their contempt. They spoke over me, dismissed my opinions, and treated me like a ghost haunting my own living room. By Sunday afternoon, the crisp Denver air had warmed slightly, bathing the massive front lawn in golden late-day sunlight. I decided to step outside onto the wide wrap-around porch, carrying a fresh cup of coffee. I stood near the heavy stone columns, looking out over the manicured landscaping I had paid to maintain for over 20 years. I was mentally reviewing the sequence of events required for the boardroom ambush, verifying every single variable, when a sudden, aggressive roar of high-performance engines shattered the quiet suburban tranquility. I looked down the long, winding driveway as the heavy wrought iron gates slowly swung open. Two massive, brand-new, midnight black luxury sport utility vehicles rolled onto the property. They were the absolute top-of-the-line models, glittering with chrome accents and dealer tags still affixed to the tinted windows. They parked side by side on the circular cobblestone driveway with an arrogant, aggressive screech of tires. The driver's side doors opened simultaneously. Derek stepped out of the first vehicle, wearing designer sunglasses and a tailored leather jacket. His wife, Sarah, climbed out of the second vehicle, holding a massive, brightly colored designer shopping bag. They were laughing loudly, pointing at the gleaming, heavily financed machines. The reality of the scene washed over me with absolute clarity. These vehicles cost well over $100,000 each. Derek had not paid cash for them. He had leveraged his pristine credit, a credit score I had helped him build, to finance these extravagant purchases based entirely on the expectation of his impending inheritance. They were already spending the $50 million. They were celebrating their massive payday 5 days before the ink was even on the paper. Their greed had completely blinded them to basic financial caution. Derek noticed me standing on the elevated porch. He took off his expensive sunglasses and looked up at me, flashing that specific, hateful smirk that belonged entirely to Gregory Lawson. He called out, asking me how I liked the new fleet, bragging that it was time to upgrade their lifestyle to match their future status. I stood perfectly still on the wooden deck. I did not frown. I did not show an ounce of the cold, lethal anticipation burning in my veins. Instead, I raised my coffee cup in a gentle, approving salute. I gave them a wide, warm, completely authentic smile, and I waved. Friday morning broke with a cold clarity. I woke up at 5 o'clock, before the sun crested the horizon. For the first time in months, I did not feel the heavy, suffocating weight of betrayal pressing down on my chest. I felt exceptionally light. The agonizing fog of deception that had clouded my home for 30 years was finally clearing, replaced by the sharp, unforgiving adrenaline of the executioner. I slid out of bed silently, careful not to wake the woman beside me. Joanne was resting peacefully, her breathing deep and even, dreaming of the $50 million she believed was only hours away. I looked at her resting face one last time, acknowledging that this was the absolute end of our shared existence. I walked quietly into my master bathroom and turned on the shower, letting the scalding hot water wash away the final remnants of the fragile, clueless old man I had been pretending to be all week. I dressed with clinical precision. I bypassed the comfortable, soft knit sweaters and slacks Joanne had laid out for me the night before. Instead, I selected my sharpest, darkest, tailored charcoal suit. I buttoned a crisp white dress shirt, fastened a solid crimson silk tie, and secured my heavy gold cufflinks. I stood in front of the mirror. I did not look like a defeated retiree heading to a slaughter. I looked like the ruthless, uncompromising chief executive officer who had built a $30 million empire from a single rusted van. I picked up my heavy leather briefcase containing the forged acquisition documents Collins prepared and walked downstairs. The kitchen was bathed in bright light. Joanne was standing at the marble island, pouring freshly brewed coffee into expensive porcelain mugs. She wore a perfectly tailored designer dress, insisting on attending the board meeting as an observer to witness my historic transition into retirement. I knew she was really there to ensure the bankruptcy documents were signed and to instantly notify Gregory Lawson's estate lawyers the second the ink dried. Derek leaned casually against the granite counter, sipping his coffee and scrolling through his phone. He was dressed in an immaculate navy blue suit, exuding an aura of absolute, untouchable confidence. As I walked into the kitchen carrying my briefcase, Joanne turned and offered a radiant, fake smile. She handed me a cup of coffee and kissed my cheek, whispering that today was the first day of our wonderful new life together. I took the mug and offered a weak, trembling smile in return, perfectly maintaining my facade of exhaustion. Derek set his phone down, walked over, and clapped me firmly on the shoulder. His grip was strong, patronizing, and utterly devoid of genuine respect. He looked me straight in the eyes and said, "Do not worry about a thing today, Dad. I am taking care of your legacy." The sheer magnitude of his arrogance was staggering. He was actively planning to bankrupt me, yet he wore the mask of a devoted son with terrifying ease. I patted his hand, letting my voice waver just enough to sound completely defeated. I told him I knew he was, and that I was finally ready to let it all go. I left the kitchen and walked out to my truck, placing the briefcase on the passenger seat. The drive from my suburban fortress to headquarters was a journey I had made thousands of times over 3 decades. Today, the route felt entirely different. Navigating through the morning Denver traffic, watching sunlight reflect off the towering glass buildings, a profound sense of liberation washed over me. The crushing weight of 30 years of lies, the exhausting burden of funding my enemy's bloodline, the painful realization of my fake family, all of it was actively lifting off my shoulders with every mile I drove. I was not driving toward my ruin. I was driving toward my absolute emancipation. I patted the leather briefcase resting beside me. Inside that bag was the key to my freedom and the instrument of their total destruction. I thought about the $35 million waiting for me in an irrevocable blind trust. I thought about the shock that would soon shatter their greedy, arrogant faces. The fear and sadness that had haunted me since Dr. Berman delivered the impossible diagnosis were completely gone, replaced by a cold, steady anticipation. I pulled into my reserved parking space at the corporate headquarters, turned off the engine, and took one final deep breath. I gripped the handle of my briefcase, stepped out of the truck, and walked through the main glass doors of Dawson Heating and Air for what I knew would be the very last time. I bypassed the busy reception desk and walked purposefully down the main executive corridor. My posture was straight, my stride was even, and my face was an unreadable mask of corporate authority. Employees nodded politely as I passed, completely unaware that the foundation of the company was about to radically shift beneath their feet. I approached the heavy glass walls of the primary executive conference room at the end of the hall. The morning sunlight poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the polished mahogany boardroom table. I slowed my pace just slightly, observing the scene unfolding inside the soundproof room before I opened the door. Derek was sitting at the head of the table, organizing a massive stack of legal documents with aggressive, eager energy. Melanie was seated to his right, furiously typing on her laptop, ensuring the human resources liabilities were perfectly aligned for the collapse. Joanne sat quietly in the corner observer chair, sipping water, her posture rigid with poorly concealed anticipation. I placed my hand firmly on the cool metal handle of the conference room door. I looked through the glass at my treacherous wife and the biological children of my greatest enemy. They were waiting for me inside, circling the table like starving wolves absolutely ready to feed. I pushed down on the metal handle and pushed the heavy glass door open. The quiet hum of the climate control system was instantly replaced by the tense, electrified atmosphere of the conference room. All 3 of them turned to look at me simultaneously. Joanne offered me a warm, completely fabricated smile from her seat in the corner, crossing her legs and smoothing the fabric of her designer dress. Melanie quickly closed her laptop screen, snapping it shut with a sharp click that echoed in the large room. Derek stood up from his leather executive chair at the head of the massive mahogany table. He extended his arm toward the empty seat to his immediate right, gesturing for me to sit down like a gracious host, welcoming a guest into his own home. I shuffled forward, letting my shoulders slump heavily, dragging my feet just enough to sell the illusion of a broken, exhausted old man who had finally surrendered his life to the inevitable march of time. I placed my heavy leather briefcase on the floor right beside my chair and sat down slowly, letting out a long, ragged sigh that sounded like absolute defeat. Derek did not waste a single second. He was practically vibrating with barely contained, nervous energy. He reached out and grabbed a massive, professionally bound black binder resting in the center of the table. He slid it firmly across the polished wood until it stopped directly in front of me. The thick stack of papers inside represented the final, fatal blow to my $30 million corporate empire. Derek leaned over me, placing his hands flat on the table, invading my personal space with the aggressive confidence of a predator. He spoke in a low, soothing, entirely patronizing voice. He told me that this was the final step of the corporate restructuring process we had discussed. He explained that by signing these specific authorizations, we were permanently shifting all the operational debt and toxic liabilities into the secondary holding company. He looked me straight in the eyes and promised me that this brilliant financial maneuver would completely shield my personal retirement accounts and allow us all to walk away clean from the crushing burdens of the modern commercial market. He was so incredibly smooth, so perfectly polished, that it sickened me to my core. I stared down at the black binder, letting the silence stretch out uncomfortably long. I needed them to feel the tension, to taste the desperation of their impending victory. I slowly reached up and rubbed my tired eyes, squinting down at the complex legal jargon printed on the very first page. I shook my head weakly, playing the part of the confused, overwhelmed founder who was simply too tired to comprehend the dense paragraphs. I patted the pockets of my charcoal suit jacket, pretending to search frantically for my reading glasses. I let a small, frustrated sigh escape my lips. I mumbled that the font was just too incredibly small for my failing vision, and that the legal phrasing was simply too dense for my exhausted mind to process this early in the morning. Joanne shifted impatiently in her chair behind me, the fabric of her dress rustling loudly in the quiet room. Melanie tapped her manicured fingernails aggressively against the polished mahogany table, completely unable to hide her profound irritation at my delayed compliance. They were mere inches away from their $50 million inheritance, and my fabricated incompetence was torturing them. I reached down to the floor and picked up my heavy leather briefcase. I placed it squarely on the conference table right next to Derek's fraudulent binder. I unfastened the brass clasps, letting them pop open with a sharp, satisfying metallic click. I reached inside and pulled out the identical black binder that my attorney Collins had meticulously crafted the night before. I placed it directly on top of Derek's stack of papers. I looked up at my son and offered a weak, deeply apologetic smile. I told him that I had asked my personal retirement lawyer, Collins, to review the general structure of the debt transfer over the weekend, just to give me some peace of mind. I explained that Collins had prepared these exact same documents, but he had reprinted the entire package using a much larger font size specifically tailored for my failing eyesight. I patted the cover of my forged binder gently. I assured Derek that it was the exact same corporate structure and the exact same liability shift he had proposed, but it was just formatted slightly differently to align with the specific legal requirements of my private retirement trust. I pushed the binder toward the center of the table. I told them that because the new formatting involved my personal trust, I just needed the two of them to co-sign the final pages alongside me as the acting executive directors of the holding company. The air in the room suddenly grew incredibly dense. For one terrifying, heart-stopping fraction of a second, Derek hesitated. He looked down at the new black binder, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed the unexpected deviation from his meticulously planned script. If he opened that binder and actually read the fine print, if he bothered to scan the specific legal clauses Collins had buried deep within the oversized text, he would instantly realize he was not signing a bankruptcy declaration. He would see the name Apex Industries. He would see the immediate, unrestricted transfer of all corporate assets. He would realize he was legally authorizing the total liquidation of the company and permanently destroying his access to the $50 million trust fund left by Gregory Lawson. The entire trap hinged entirely on his monumental, blinding arrogance. I held my breath, keeping my face completely devoid of any tension. I watched the greed actively war with the caution in his eyes. But Derek was so profoundly intoxicated by his own impending wealth, so absolutely convinced of my complete and utter incompetence, that his arrogance easily won the battle. He looked at Melanie, who offered him a quick, impatient nod, silently urging him to just get the tedious paperwork over with so they could finally celebrate their massive payday. Derek let out a short, dismissive sigh, clearly annoyed by the inconvenience of my elderly demands, but completely unwilling to derail the momentum of the meeting over a simple font size. He reached across the table and aggressively pulled my binder toward him. He flipped callously past the dense pages of legal text, entirely ignoring the complex corporate jargon, searching only for the blank signature lines at the very back of the package. He grabbed a silver luxury pen from the center of the table and forcefully signed his name across the first designated line. He then slid the heavy binder over to Melanie. She did not even bother to look at the preceding pages. She simply snatched the pen from her brother's hand and quickly scribbled her signature directly beneath his. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair, my hands resting calmly on the cool mahogany table. I did not blink. I did not look away. I simply watched the dark blue ink permanently stain the crisp white paper, sealing their absolute, irreversible destruction. The heavy silence in the room was suddenly broken by the sharp sound of the glass conference room door swinging open. A woman in a tailored gray suit stepped inside, carrying a small leather ledger and a brass stamp. It was Miss Higgins, the senior public notary I had specifically requested to be on standby for this exact moment. She walked briskly toward the mahogany table, completely oblivious to the suffocating tension radiating from my wife and the two executives sitting beside me. Derek let out an exasperated sigh, clearly annoyed by the formal interruption, but he slid the heavy black binder across the polished wood toward her. Miss Higgins asked Derek and Melanie to present their government-issued identification cards. They complied with impatient, aggressive movements, tossing their driver licenses onto the table. She meticulously verified their identities, checked the corresponding signatures on the thick stack of paper, and asked them both to verbally confirm that they were signing the documents of their own free will. Derek rolled his eyes and stated yes in a flat, arrogant tone. Melanie quickly echoed his confirmation, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. Miss Higgins pressed her brass seal firmly against the final page, the heavy stamp leaving a permanent, embossed impression on the crisp white paper. She signed her own name, closed her ledger, and quietly excused herself from the room. The second the heavy glass door clicked shut behind the notary, the entire atmosphere of the room fundamentally altered. The door immediately opened again, but this time it was not an administrative assistant or a neutral observer. It was Collins. My ruthless, brilliant corporate attorney strode into the conference room with the predatory confidence of a wolf entering a sheep pen. He carried a sleek, slim briefcase and wore a dark, uncompromising suit. Joanne shifted uncomfortably in her corner chair, her perfect posture faltering for the very first time. She knew Collins. She knew he only appeared when I was preparing for an absolute, scorched earth legal war. Derek frowned, confusion finally piercing through his thick layer of monumental arrogance. He demanded to know what my personal attorney was doing at an internal corporate restructuring meeting. I did not answer him immediately. I placed my hands flat on the smooth mahogany table and pushed myself up from the leather chair. The shuffling, defeated posture of the clueless old man vanished completely, shed like a heavy, suffocating coat. I stood tall, squaring my shoulders and pulling myself up to my full height. The manufactured exhaustion disappeared from my face, replaced entirely by a cold, calculating, and lethal authority. I looked down at the people who had spent an entire year plotting my financial murder. I looked at the son who had called me a clueless old man behind my back. I looked at the daughter who had actively sabotaged the company I built to feed her. I looked at the wife who had orchestrated a 30-year biological lie just to secure her own wealth. I reached across the table and placed my hand firmly on top of the black binder they had just signed. I pulled it slowly toward me, feeling the immense, satisfying weight of their monumental failure. I looked directly into the eyes of the man who thought he had just won $50 million. I let the silence stretch for a long, agonizing moment, ensuring that he felt the sudden, terrifying shift in the power dynamic. Then, I spoke in a voice so cold and steady it seemed to freeze the very air in the room. "Congratulations, Derek," I said smoothly. "You did not bankrupt the company today. You just legally authorized its complete and total sale to Apex Industries for exactly $35 million in liquid cash. The company you thought you were destroying no longer exists." The words hung in the air like a physical manifestation of a lethal poison. Derek stared at me, his eyes wide and completely uncomprehending. His brain, so thoroughly intoxicated by greed and arrogance, simply refused to process the reality of my statement. He looked down at this black binder resting under my hand, then looked back up at my face. He opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. The luxurious silver pen he had used to sign away his entire future slipped slowly from his trembling fingers. It hit the polished mahogany table with a loud, hollow clatter, rolling aimlessly across the wood before dropping onto the carpeted floor. In the corner of the room, Joanne let out a sharp, strangled gasp. It was the sound of a woman watching her perfectly constructed universe shatter into a million irreparable pieces. She grabbed the armrests of her chair, her knuckles turning bone white as the horrific truth finally crashed over her. She knew exactly what a profitable $35 million acquisition meant for the vindictive trust fund waiting in Seattle. She knew that the specific condition required my absolute financial ruin, not a massive, highly lucrative corporate buyout. Melanie began to hyperventilate, her chest heaving with rapid, shallow breaths as her eyes darted frantically between my face, the heavy black binder, and the imposing figure of Collins standing silently by the door. Derek finally found his voice, though it was nothing more than a ragged, desperate whisper. He stammered that it was completely impossible, that he had prepared the bankruptcy filings himself, and that I was lying. I did not raise my voice. I simply tapped the cover of the binder with my index finger and told him he should have bothered to read the fine print. The realization of what they had just blindly signed crashed violently over the entire room, suffocating them with the undeniable, crushing weight of their own absolute ruin. Their perfectly crafted deception had failed entirely. They were no longer the wealthy heirs of a massive fortune. They were nothing more than fools trapped inside a cage. My cage. The silence shattered into a million jagged pieces. Derek pushed himself away from the heavy mahogany table, his expensive leather chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor. He began to stammer, his voice rising in pitch, repeating that it was a mistake, that I was confused, that the documents he brought were the only valid filings in the room. Melanie covered her mouth with both hands, her breathing escalating into a full, panicked hyperventilation. She looked at her brother, pleading silently for him to fix the catastrophic error they had just authorized. But it was Joanne who finally broke the paralysis. She leaped from her observer chair in the corner of the room, her designer heels clicking frantically across the floor. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. Her voice was shrill, completely stripped of its usual polished elegance. She screamed that I had finally lost my mind, that the stress of the impending bankruptcy had triggered a psychotic break, and that Collins was feeding my delusions. She demanded that the notary be called back immediately to invalidate the signatures, claiming I had forcefully coerced her children into signing meaningless, fabricated paperwork. I did not flinch at her shrill accusations. I did not raise my voice to match her frantic energy. I simply reached down to the cold, hard floor, picked up my heavy, worn leather briefcase for the second time, and carefully unfastened the 2 brass clasps. I reached my hand inside and slowly pulled out the thick manila envelope Victor Russo had handed me in that freezing parking structure just a few days ago. I pulled the crisp, white laboratory report from the envelope and tossed it casually onto the center of the mahogany table. It slid smoothly across the polished wood, stopping mere inches from Derek. I told him to look at it. I told him to read the bold numbers printed at the bottom of the page. Derek hesitated, his eyes darting between my cold expression and the medical document. He slowly reached out and picked up the paper. I watched his arrogant eyes scan the text. I watched the blood drain entirely from his arrogant, greedy face as he read the genetic probability. 99.9%. He dropped the paper as if it were burning his fingers. Melanie snatched it up, her eyes widening in absolute horror as she read the name printed at the top of the comparison profile. Gregory Lawson. Joanne stopped screaming instantly. Her mouth snapped shut, and she took a slow, unsteady step backward, her perfectly constructed facade collapsing into pure, unadulterated terror. I looked directly into her wide, panicked eyes. I told her that I knew the truth. I said I knew the anonymous sperm bank clinic was nothing but a calculated, pathetic lie designed to protect her wealthy lifestyle. I told her I knew she had slept with my greatest enemy the exact same year I had stripped him of his equity and expelled him from this very company. I said I knew that for 31 years, she had forced me to feed, clothe, and build an empire for the biological children of a man who swore to destroy everything I loved. The room grew so incredibly quiet that the only sound was the frantic, shallow breathing of the 3 traitors standing before me. Before they could attempt to formulate a single defensive lie, I reached back into my briefcase. I pulled out the copy of the last will and testament of Gregory Lawson. I threw the heavy legal packet onto the table. It landed with a loud, definitive smack right next to the genetic testing results. I told them I also knew about the $50 million trust fund waiting in Seattle. I watched Derek flinch, his shoulders drawing inward as the full magnitude of my awareness crushed him. I spoke in a slow, deliberate cadence, making sure every single syllable pierced through their greed. I said, I know about Gregory. I know about the clinic lie. And I know you needed me bankrupt to get your $50 million. I detailed their entire sabotage. I exposed Melanie and her deliberate human resources liabilities. I exposed Derek and his toxic loans, his fraudulent transfers, and his fake tax optimization strategy. I told them they were so blinded by the promise of their dead father's money that they completely underestimated the man who actually raised them. I told them their plan was a spectacular failure, and that they had just signed away the only leverage they had left. Derek could no longer contain the explosive mixture of humiliation and rage boiling inside him. The realization that he had personally signed the documents authorizing the acquisition, entirely obliterating his chance at the trust fund, finally snapped his remaining composure. He let out a visceral, guttural shout and lunged violently across the mahogany conference table. He knocked over a water glass, sending crystal shattering onto the floor as he reached aggressively toward the lapels of my tailored suit jacket. He screamed that I was a fraud, that I had maliciously tricked them, and that he would tie me up in litigation for the rest of my miserable life. He threatened to sue me for coercion, for deceptive practices, and for corporate sabotage, swearing he would drag my name through the mud until the acquisition was completely nullified. I did not move a single muscle. I stood perfectly still, watching him unravel into a pathetic, desperate child. Before his hands could even reach my suit, Colin stepped seamlessly between us. My attorney did not shout. He did not issue a physical threat. He simply raised a calm, steady hand, forcing Derek to stop his frantic advance. Collins picked up his sleek briefcase, set it on the table, and unzipped a brand new folder. He looked at Derek with absolute freezing professional detachment, preparing to explain exactly why they had absolutely no legal leg to stand on. Collins did not raise his voice at all. He did not need to. He commanded the room with the effortless authority of a man who held every single winning card in his hand. He looked at Derek, who was still breathing heavily, leaning aggressively over the shattered crystal on the floor. Collins opened the sleek leather folder he had just placed on the mahogany table and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a certified copy of the acquisition agreement they had just signed. He slid it directly toward Derek, tapping the embossed notary seal with his silver pen. He spoke in a crisp, measured tone, explaining that filing a lawsuit for coercion would require proof that they were forced to sign against their will. He reminded Derek that minutes ago, in front of a licensed notary, he and Melanie verbally confirmed they were signing freely and voluntarily. He pointed out that as acting executive directors of the secondary holding company, it was their absolute legal fiduciary duty to read and comprehend every single page before applying their signatures. Claiming ignorance or negligence in a corporate buyout of this magnitude would not win a lawsuit. It would only expose them to severe civil liabilities and potential criminal charges for gross corporate mismanagement. Derek stared at the document, the flush of anger draining from his cheeks, leaving an ashen gray. But Collins was not finished. He turned his attention to the copy of Gregory Lawson's last will and testament resting on the table. He picked it up with a distinct look of professional disgust. He looked directly at Joanne, then at Melanie, and finally back to Derek. He told them he had personally reviewed the disbursement conditions of the $50 million trust fund. He recited the specific legal phrasing from memory, his voice cutting through the silent room like a scalpel. He reminded them the trust explicitly required the total financial insolvency of Dawson Heating and Air, alongside my absolute negative personal net worth, before my 71st birthday. He paused, letting the devastating reality of those specific words hang in the air. Then, he delivered the fatal blow. He explained that because the company was just sold legitimately, seamlessly, and highly profitably to Apex Industries, the foundational condition of the will had definitively failed. The business was not bankrupt. It was successfully acquired. My net worth was not negative. It had just increased by $35 million. Melanie let out a very sharp, choked gasp, stumbling backward until her legs hit a leather chair. She collapsed, gripping the armrests. Collins continued, his voice devoid of any sympathy. He stated that the exact legal consequence of this profitable acquisition was the immediate and permanent nullification of the trust fund. He told them that according to the strict default clauses written by Gregory Lawson himself, the $50 million was now completely voided. The money they had been spending in their mungs, the fortune they had taken out massive loans against, was instantly and irrevocably gone. It was already scheduled to be transferred entirely to a list of designated wildlife and medical charities in Seattle. They were getting absolutely nothing from their biological father. The immense generational wealth they had betrayed me for had just evaporated into thin air because of their own signatures. Derek shook his head frantically, his eyes darting wildly around the large boardroom. He stammered that they still had rights to the company assets, claiming that since they were executives of the holding company, they were legally entitled to a massive percentage of the $35 million acquisition payout. He demanded his share of the buyout. Collins offered him a tight, completely humorless smile. He shook his head slowly. He explained the second edge of the razor-sharp sword they had just thrown themselves upon. He pointed back to the acquisition papers. He clarified that the documents they had rushed to sign did not just authorize the sale. They legally relinquished all executive control and surrendered every single physical and intellectual asset within the holding company directly to Apex Industries. Furthermore, The entire $35 million purchase price was legally routed directly into an irrevocable blind trust. The sole exclusive beneficiary of that trust was Richard Dawson. Because they had willingly signed the release authorizations as corporate officers, they had absolutely zero legal claim to a single cent of the sale. They had effectively fired themselves, dissolved their own leverage, and handed the entire fortune directly to me. The sheer, crushing weight of their absolute, undeniable ruin finally collapsed the ceiling of their arrogance. The perfect, arrogant facade they had maintained for almost a year shattered completely. Derek sank to his knees, his hands tearing at his perfectly styled hair, his breath coming in ragged, desperate heaves as he realized he was millions of dollars in debt, with no inheritance, no job, and no future. Melanie began hyperventilating violently, her chest rising and falling in rapid, uncontrolled spasms as the terrifying reality of her impending personal bankruptcy suffocated her. She clutched her throat, staring blankly at the wall. Joanne, the architect of this entire 30-year biological lie, finally broke. She fell heavily to her knees on the expensive carpet, crawling forward until she was right at my feet. She reached out with trembling hands, grabbing the fabric of my trousers, weeping with a pathetic, agonizing desperation. She desperately begged me to undo it, pleading that we were a family, screaming that she loved me and that we could somehow fix this terrible mistake. I looked down at the woman who had deceived me for 3 decades. I looked at the greedy strangers she had brought into my home. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I reached down, gently but firmly pried her desperate fingers off my clothing, and stepped back. I slowly and methodically buttoned my charcoal suit jacket, standing tall over the smoking ruins of their lives. I looked down at Joanne, whose tear-streaked face was turned up toward me in a mask of absolute, pathetic desperation. She was waiting for the merciful husband she had manipulated for 32 years to suddenly reappear and offer her a lifeline. But that man was dead. I looked at Melanie, who was gasping for air against the leather chair, and then at Derek, who was still kneeling on the floor, surrounded by the shattered crystal of the water glass he had broken. The silence in the room was heavy, broken only by their ragged, terrified breathing. I took a slow, deliberate step back from the mahogany table, ensuring they all had a perfectly clear view of the man they had entirely underestimated. I told Joanne that her performance was officially over. I told her that for 3 decades, I had broken my back, ruined my knees, and sacrificed my own peace of mind to build a kingdom for a bloodline that belonged to my greatest enemy. I said that her deceit was so profound, so meticulously calculated, that it defied every single boundary of human decency. I told her she had traded my genuine love for the hollow promise of a dead man, and in doing so, she had successfully engineered her own absolute destruction. I turned my gaze to Derek. He refused to meet my eyes, staring blankly at the dark carpet. I told him that I had handed him the keys to a thriving $30 million commercial empire. I had given him the title, the salary, and the absolute unearned privilege of an heir. But instead of gratitude, he had chosen treason. I reminded him of the afternoon I stood outside his office and listened to him call me a clueless old man. I told him that his monumental arrogance was his ultimate downfall. He was so incredibly eager to trigger his $50 million payout that he blindly signed away the very company he was attempting to bankrupt. I looked at Melanie and told her that her deliberate sabotage of the Human Resources Department, her calculated financial bleeding of my reserves, was nothing short of corporate treason. I said they had both proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that they shared the exact same corrupt, treacherous DNA as Gregory Lawson. They were entirely his biological children, possessing his greed, his hubris, and his spectacular ability to lose absolutely everything in the blink of an eye. I reached down and picked up my worn leather briefcase, the one that had just secured my permanent freedom. I looked at the three of them one last time. I let my voice drop to a low, completely unwavering pitch that carried the full weight of my victory. I said, "You wanted me bankrupt before my 71st birthday. Instead, I am retiring rich, and you are all unemployed." I turned my back on them and walked toward the glass conference room door. Behind me, the paralyzed silence finally shattered. The realization of their shared ruin instantly turned them against one another. Derek began screaming at Joanne, blaming her for pushing the timeline, while Melanie shrieked at Derek for failing to read the legal documents he had forced her to sign. Their voices echoed through the glass walls, a vicious, feral cacophony of blame and despair. I pushed the heavy door open and walked out into the corridor. I did not look back. I strode past the reception desk, out the main doors, and into the bright, crisp Denver morning. I left the building I had built from nothing, leaving them trapped inside the burning wreckage of their own insatiable greed. The fallout from that morning was as swift as it was utterly devastating. Within 3 short weeks, the illusion of their wealthy, privileged lives completely collapsed. Without their executive salaries, and carrying the massive weight of the high-interest loans they had taken out in anticipation of their inheritance, Derek and his wife were financially decimated. On a rainy Tuesday morning, 2 heavy tow trucks pulled into their pristine suburban driveway. Neighbors watched from their windows as the repossession agents hooked up the 2 brand-new, midnight black luxury sport utility vehicles they had so arrogantly paraded in front of me. Derek stood on his porch, stripped of his designer suits and his manufactured confidence, watching his fabricated wealth literally being dragged away down the street. Meanwhile, Joanne found herself sitting alone in the sprawling, empty house she had decorated with my money. The doorbell rang, delivering a process server holding a thick stack of legal documents. She was officially served with divorce papers, filed by Collins, carrying a brutal, uncompromising stipulation. Due to the irrefutable, documented proof of 30 years of deliberate paternity fraud, the prenuptial clauses were fully activated. Joanne was granted absolutely nothing: no alimony, no real estate, and no access to the $35 million trust fund. She was left with nothing but the empty echo of the life she had systematically destroyed. The consequences cascaded rapidly, stripping away every single luxury they had grown to expect. Melanie found herself entirely unemployable in the corporate sector, her professional reputation permanently ruined by the documented gross negligence she had purposefully enacted during her tenure in the Human Resources Department. The 3 of them were completely severed from the sprawling financial safety net they had blindly taken for granted. They had conspired to push me into a dark, inescapable abyss, but their immense greed blinded them to the reality of the trap they had so foolishly stepped into. I watched from afar as their carefully constructed universe dissolved into dust, leaving them to face the absolute, undeniable poverty they had so maliciously intended for me. The war was officially over, and the people who tried to bury me were now buried under their own monumental greed. My life was finally returning to a sense of quiet, absolute, and fully deserved peace. I was free. 6 months have passed since I walked out of that glass building and closed the heavy door on my former life. Today, the freezing winds of Denver are nothing more than a distant memory. I am standing under the endless, brilliant blue sky of Scottsdale, Arizona. The morning sun warms my shoulders as I line up my shot on the pristine emerald green fairway of a private championship golf course. I take a smooth, effortless swing, watching the small white ball sail perfectly down the center of the manicured grass. I lean on my club and take a deep, unobstructed breath of the dry desert air. For the first time in over 3 decades, my chest does not ache with the heavy, suffocating pressure of carrying ungrateful people on my back. The physical transformation is undeniable. The deep gray shadows of exhaustion that used to haunt my face have completely faded. I now sleep soundly through the entire night. My mind is sharp, uncluttered by the endless corporate logistics and the silent, exhausting psychological warfare of my past. I have traded the grueling, relentless pursuit of a fabricated legacy for the profound, absolute tranquility of an authentic, unburdened existence. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between the bustling activities of my new life, I reflect on the incredible journey that brought me to this peaceful desert oasis. I think about the staggering magnitude of the deception that defined my existence for 32 years. I spent decades breaking my body, sacrificing my youth, and pouring my soul into an empire, completely believing I was building a fortress of security for my own flesh and blood. I believed that love was measured by the amount of wealth I could provide, and that family was an unbreakable, sacred bond. But the brutal, uncompromising reality of the boardroom ambush taught me the most valuable lesson of my entire life. I learned that blood absolutely does not make a family. Shared genetics do not guarantee respect, and a shared surname does not automatically entitle anyone to your unwavering devotion. True family is forged in the fires of mutual respect, unyielding honesty, and absolute loyalty. Joanne, Derek, and Melanie possessed none of those vital qualities. They were parasites wrapped in the comforting disguise of domestic bliss, draining my resources while secretly harboring the toxic, vindictive DNA of my greatest enemy. When I finally uncovered their monumental betrayal, I thought the grief would completely destroy me. I thought losing the wife I trusted and the children I raised would leave me entirely broken, an empty shell of a man waiting for the end. But removing them from my life did not diminish my spirit. It actually resurrected it. Liquidating the commercial empire and walking away from their insatiable greed was not a defeat. It was the ultimate, resounding victory. I lost a fake, manipulative family, but the sheer volume of what I gained in return is absolutely staggering. I gained my complete, unrestricted freedom. I gained an immense, heavily protected fortune of $35 million that can never be touched or manipulated by their deceitful hands. I have surrounded myself with people who value my presence, not my bank accounts. Men like my attorney Collins and my former financial officer Thomas, who proved their loyalty when the stakes were highest, are the kind of people I now call my true circle. But above the money, and far above the physical freedom, I successfully reclaimed the most precious asset a man can possibly possess. I reclaimed my absolute, uncompromising self-respect. I no longer harbor any lingering anger toward the people I left behind in Denver. The burning, volatile rage that fueled my meticulous revenge has completely burned itself out, leaving nothing but a cool, detached indifference. I do not monitor their lives, and I do not celebrate their ongoing financial ruin. They are actively living the miserable, desperate reality they maliciously designed for me, and that is their permanent burden to carry. Their punishment is waking up every single morning, knowing they held a golden ticket to a beautiful life, but threw it directly into the fire out of pure, arrogant greed. My days are now filled with genuine joy, quiet contemplation, and the freedom to explore passions I ignored for decades. I travel to places I always wanted to see. I read books I never had the time to open. I sit on the patio of my new home, watching the spectacular desert sunsets, and I feel a profound sense of gratitude for the impossible medical diagnosis that forced me to finally open my eyes. That single sheet of paper shattered a comfortable lie, but it ultimately saved my life. I have learned that it takes an incredible amount of courage to closely examine the life you built, recognize the deep, systemic rot hidden within its foundation, and find the immense strength to tear the entire structure down. Walking away from the very people you love when they deliberately prove they are actively trying to destroy you is undoubtedly the absolute hardest decision you will ever make. But it is also the only guaranteed way to ensure your own survival. As I stand here on this beautiful, sunlit fairway, peacefully preparing to thoroughly enjoy the rest of my quiet afternoon, I want to share a final, vital piece of hard-earned wisdom with you. Never let anyone convince you that silently enduring financial and emotional abuse is a mandatory requirement of maintaining a family. You possess the absolute, undeniable right to fiercely protect your hard-won peace, your personal assets, and your mental well-being, completely regardless of who is standing on the opposite side of the battlefield. Your future is always worth boldly defending. So, if you've ever trusted the wrong people and had to walk away to save yourself, leave a comment below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more stories. Remember, your legacy isn't your money, it's your self-respect.